47 people so far, with more coming in. Okay, I will go ahead and start. Welcome to the first session of the House Divided class. I'm Steve Baska, our moderator, and I will run the Zoom controls. Our speaker tonight is Rev. Mark Feldmeyer, the author of our book, and he's going to talk about the first chapter, climate change. So kind of ironic that it's today, September 8th, when we just had a swing of 60-some degrees between summer and snowing today. So ironic. We have 49 people on so far and more coming on. So we want to welcome everybody, including St. Andrew folks and new visitors. We're glad you can be here for this session. We've got a few other announcements also. Recording this for later playback. We've got a lot of requests for people that can't be here tonight that would like to have it recorded, and so we are recording this, and then with Mark's permission afterwards, if everything goes fine, we will post this on YouTube. Second thing is, please mute yourself. In the lower left corner of your screen is a little mic icon, and if you'll go down there and click on that, it'll put a red line through there, and that will mute your sound so we don't hear background noise. That will help a lot. And then when you want to speak, unmute it and speak up loud so we can hear you. Also, about making comments. When you do make a comment here, please be kind to our speaker and to each other. We are talking about divisive issues here in this series. People will have strong feelings, and we are here to discuss respectfully and ask that you keep your comments fairly brief. And if we do get into anything with people challenging or arguing, I will not hesitate to mute that person for the rest of the hour. But I'm confident that we'll have a good, respectful discussion. And lastly, the video section, you don't have to be on screen seen if you don't want to. In the lower left is your video icon. You can click on that and you don't have to be seen. If you don't want to, that's perfectly fine. Our format today is going to be, I will introduce Mark, and I think he'll have a prayer, and then we're going to have a 5-minute video about the book that Mark and the book publisher have created. And then Mark will lead us in discussion on the topic, including when you want to come in and comment. So that's the basic format. So with that, please welcome Mark Feldmeyer, our senior pastor for the last 6 years at St. Andrew and author of several books, including the one that premiered today on Amazon. Congratulations, Mark, on this good book and the reception it's getting.
Well, thanks, Steve. And thank you, all of you, for being on this call. It really is just fabulous to see you. And, as pastors, we aren't used to pandemics. None of us are, but certainly our ministry itself is so incarnational that being apart from one another physically it's been a tough journey. So to see all of your faces engaged and ready to jump into some divisive issues that ultimately don't have to be divisive, and we want to recognize that on this very call, we may be of different minds on the issue of climate change, at least in terms of what the causes might be, or perhaps even whether there's such a thing as climate change. And so I want to acknowledge a diversity of opinions and a diversity of backgrounds that include both theological diversity, political diversity, scientific diversity, educational diversity. So we're all bringing that to the table. I'm actually working on an article right now on some of the rules for how we have conversations that are difficult. And what I would say today is our task is to try to stay at the table for as long as we can, to acknowledge that there are going to be differences, but that doesn't mean we have to get up and push ourselves away from the table in frustration over disagreements. We are really operating on axioms, things that we can all agree upon, places where we can begin. And those beginning points may lead us in totally different directions ultimately, or at least in totally different destinations. But I hope that we can stay at the table long enough to have thoughtful and faithful conversations about climate change today. And with that, I'll open up with a prayer, and it's a prayer that I wrote for the book. If you have the book and you're following along and you want to follow along, it's on page 17, but you don't have to follow along at all. But this is the opening prayer for tonight, a prayer for guidance and grace. Let's pray. God of the universe, God of the single cell, heaven and earth are full of your glory. We gather tonight in awe of all that you have created and called good in the world. In a spirit of humility, we gather with gratitude that in your infinite wisdom and concern for creation, you are ever mindful even of us. Amen. So I think to get us into tonight's study, it'll be helpful to begin with a video that I've created for the book. This is just one video, and each chapter of the book has a corresponding video to help sort of introduce the topic and hopefully to sort of set us at ease that we can have conversations that don't have to be controversial or at least antagonistic. So we're going to go to this video, and you're going to hear an opening lyric from a band called The Brilliance. They are a Christian band, although I use that differently than what maybe some of us understand as Christian music. They're more post-evangelical Christians who have a real heart for justice and for mercy. And so the lyric that you'll hear tonight, both at the beginning of this video as well as at the end, and with every corresponding video, it goes like this: give me doubt that I might see my neighbor as myself. Give me doubt that I may lay my weapons on the ground. Give me, when the armor of God is too heavy for peace, give me doubt, give me doubt. That's a profound lyric. When the armor of God is too heavy for peace, give me doubt. I hope that we can approach tonight's conversation with just enough doubt or humility to understand that we don't have all the answers, but we're seeking together. So that's our prayer. We'll go to the video, and then we'll come back and start a conversation.
Okay, let me share on the screen. Is it showing up on the screen for you? Okay, Mark, can you see that on the screen?
It is, it's there.
Okay, yep. Good, here we go.
I can see my neighbor as myself. Give me doubt so I can lay all my weapons on the ground. When the armor of God is too heavy for peace, give me doubt. Give me doubt.
In Omar el-Akkad's novel American War, the year is 2074. Americans are fighting a second civil war between the North and the South. Climate change has devastated the continent. Louisiana and Florida are underwater. The arid West is uninhabitable. Food and fresh water are scarce. Millions are starving. Drone and terror attacks, torture and POW camps are commonplace. The novel's a dark, cautionary tale that extrapolates the partisan divisions that already plague American politics and examines where those widening splits could lead. It's a story that maps the palpable consequences of accelerating climate change and an unraveling United States. It's a story that invites us to put ourselves in the shoes of the world's displaced people and to imagine how we might treat each other in a climate catastrophe. It's just a story, but given what we know about the potentially devastating effects of climate change, it's at least plausible. Today, 6 in 10 Americans say global climate change is a major threat to the country. 2/3 of Americans say protecting the environment should be a top priority for politicians. The majority of Americans from both sides of the aisle say they're taking at least some action in their daily lives to protect the environment. Since the early 20th century, Earth's temperatures have increased by 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases have increased. Sea levels have risen. Where they disagree, of course, is on the specific causes for these changes. Namely, is human activity responsible for climate change? My aim isn't to convince you of a right answer to that question. In our current political environment, we often prefer right answers to right living, until our sense of rightness devolves into an intractable, self-righteous smugness. So what if instead of debating over the right answers on this issue, we commit to pursuing a more just and compassionate relationship with the earth? The 3 core commitments to a politics of compassion are kinship, kenosis, and delight. These commitments inform how we think and act in relationship to a particular issue. They can lead us to honest conversations and to collaborative solutions that make possible the flourishing of the common good. By kinship, we mean a deep sense of intimacy and connection with creation, a connection that makes domination and exploitation of the earth impermissible. What we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. We all live downstream, where we all suffer the same consequences of our individual and collective actions. By kenosis, we mean a commitment to self-emptying solidarity with creation, a willingness to alter some part of our way of life for the sake of the health of all creation. If kinship suggests that we all belong to the earth, kenosis suggests that we're all responsible for the earth. By delight, we mean the capacity to see the image of God in all living things, and there to find joy in simply being with creation in ways that defy our modern utilitarian relationship with it. If we belong to the earth, and if we're responsible for it, then we see in all of creation an inherent dignity and a sacred worth that cannot be objectified. The earth becomes a living subject that draws us into communion with it. Consider your relationship with the earth. In what ways do you depend upon it and its finite resources? How do you find deep connection with creation? What are you doing personally to ensure the flourishing of creation? And where do you find wonder and delight in its inherent beauty? Let's begin there, so that together we can find enough common ground to work together for the common good.
Give me doubt so I can see my neighbor as myself. Give me doubt so I can lay all my weapons on the ground. When the armor of God is too heavy for peace, give me doubt. Give me doubt.
Thank you, Steve, for making the technology happen. I don't know about you all, but my video was coming in and out there with an internet connection that wasn't quite as fast as the video itself. So I hope you're able to catch that. In the chapter on climate change, we are focusing on 3 axioms. An axiom, again, is a simple statement that regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, we can all agree is a good starting point for the conversation. It's typically a rational statement that is absent of theological or political opinion. And so I've made 3 axioms that I hope that we can sort of agree on as we talk about the issue. Number 1, that in any sort of unknown, we know that when the risks are exceptionally high, the wise hedge their bets. That's a more pragmatic axiom for this particular chapter. It's not theological, or even, no, you can't even say it's really biblical. Although Jesus says about the wise man who built his house upon the rock and the other one who didn't and built it on sand. I think that was a theological statement, but it was a profoundly practical and pragmatic one. In the case of science or climate change, in the event that we can't agree on the science, we can at least agree that the risks of denying climate change as a human activity caused problem far exceed the sacrifices it might take for us to mitigate that risk. So insofar as we would say climate change is not a human caused consequence, we might, if we're wrong on that, we might end up suffering a climate catastrophe. Whereas if we were to say, I'm not sure if it's true, but if I bet that it's true and I'm wrong, all it really costs me is maybe some of the ordinary conveniences of everyday life. Maybe I'll take the bus once a week instead of drive to work, or maybe I'll buy a Prius or a Tesla instead of the Ford F-150. So these kinds of things lead to, I think, a consensus that we might make some sacrifice, knowing that we could be wrong, but knowing that the consequences of betting against it and being wrong are profound. In fact, for the human race, it could mean extreme famine. It could mean war over food sources and water. It could mean ultimately limitations of where we can live in the world. So that's axiom 1. When the risks are high, the wise hedge their bets. The second axiom that I lay out in the chapter is around this idea that creation is God's first incarnation. And by that I mean, we often think of Jesus as being the incarnation of Christ. At Christmas especially, we acknowledge Jesus is God in the flesh. But if we do a closer reading of the Hebrew text of Genesis, we see that God pours God's self into creation in the very act of creation, breathing God's spirit into all things. So that when we look at anything, both living and inanimate, that is of God's creation, we can see at least a facet of God's character, God's personality in that particular thing. So creation is God's first incarnation. God materializes a part of God's spirit in order to create the world. And the third and final axiom for this chapter is that we've lost our intimate connection with creation. That is to say, we don't really, most of us don't have to work the land to get our meals. We don't have to go outside and pump from a well to get our water. Our kids grow up thinking that milk comes from the grocery store and not a cow. We rarely get outside to experience creation. I think maybe those of us here in Colorado experience more creation than other places, but we certainly don't have that same experience that the ancients had with the land. And so those are the three axioms that I try to lay out in the book. If we were to be in a physical building together right now, I would invite us to go into groups of 3 or 4 and have a conversation around some of the icebreaker questions that I've laid out in the book. But I'd like to just lift those up. And Steve, if you want to manage who gets to speak and how they're going to acknowledge that they want to speak, I'll leave that up to you. But the question I'd like to begin with tonight is, when was the last time that you felt or experienced an intimate connection with creation? When was the last time you felt or experienced an intimate connection with creation? Where were you? And what was the experience, or what was your response to that? Anybody want to share?
Mark, I would suggest if anybody wants to share, just say your name and go ahead and speak up.
Hi, this is Sonia Carter. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I guess I live in the foothills, so I feel like I experience it every day. But as a somewhat different experience, we were at the ocean for a couple of days last week, and there is something about watching the sunrise and the sunset over the ocean, which we had the great good fortune to see, that just, I don't know, just leaves one in awe all the time.
I'll make a quick comment too. This is Steve. It reminds me that Jerry Butler gave a sermon Saturday night, just a couple days ago, in which he was talking about the awesomeness of the stars. It's a spiritual thing to look up at the sky at night and contemplate the vast universe. And Jerry, I really appreciated that sermon and how it ties into the spiritual life.
Steve, I'll share an experience Harvey and I had. In late May, we planted, or had planted, 2 sugar maple trees in our backyard. We'd wanted those kind of trees for a long time, and we decided this was a good year to do it. And it was powerful to look at the big root ball and the workers, see what the workers did to get it settled in the hole they had dug. And now we look at them and from both our kitchen table and go outside very often, several times a week, to look at how we think they're each growing and so forth. But that's been a new thing for us and something that was powerful.
One of us has a habit of going out to the yard weekly and talking to one of those trees.
The one that's not growing very well.
I used to have occasions of great inspiration. I traveled a lot, and I traveled in Iowa. And you know, it's a lot of flat, well, it's hilly land, and a lot of times I'd crest a hill and the land would be just laid out in front. What a wonderful thing creation is. And also I used to climb mountains, and there's nothing like a mountaintop experience. So Steve, you climb mountains too, but you know, there's God's creation just laid out before you in all its splendor. It's really inspirational.
Jim, sometimes Mark and I have been skiing at top of Breckenridge or somewhere and look out, and it's just such an awesome view. It's a spiritual thing, for sure.
As an educator, Dorsey and I always keep a garden. We were going to give it up after our boys left because they're all in their 40s. But when the grandchildren came, we now have, you know, tomato plants, broccoli plants, pumpkins. You know, they learn they have to dig potatoes, that they don't just appear magically. Like you said, you know, the milk from the grocery store. Oh, actually, that's where applesauce comes from. I've made applesauce. I mean, you do simple things like that with children. I think that they begin to get a feel for it. And it's a fun experience for the grandchildren, and or if you don't have grandchildren, do it with your neighbor children. Invite them over if you're going to do some sort of preservation of gardens.
I remember as a teenager being out on my grandparents' farm in western Nebraska when the wheat is almost ready to be harvested. And you could just look out and see that wheat, you know, that rolling of the wheat. It really does that in the wind. And I just loved that and knew that that wheat would feed people. It provided income for my grandparents, but yet the fragility of it, because if there was a hailstorm or too many grasshoppers, then the wheat was gone.
Anybody else? Is there one more? Yeah, Barb Chambliss. You're muted.
You're muted, Barb. Click in the lower left.
How's that?
That's good.
Okay. A couple days before the Cameron fire up near Fort Collins started, we were driving through Poudre Canyon, and there's all these dead trees. They were there from other fires. And while that's not a positive, feel-good feeling with nature, it helps you appreciate when something like that hasn't happened. We were all so sad to see it.
Yeah. There is that experience that we have when we see the devastation of creation that is, it gets right to this idea of compassion. Compassion meaning, as I've said millions of times, and I know Harvey said it a million times before I got here, this idea of compassion is, the Greek word comes from splankna, which means the gut. And when we see things in creation that are disturbing, like the devastation of a wildfire, it has a real visceral gut effect on us. In the same way that when we witness beauty or wonder of creation, or as I call it, delight in the book, that also produces a feeling in the gut of compassion, or a tenderness and a connection with creation that can only come about by that experience. I since I've come to Colorado, I've taken up fly fishing, and I can't say I'm very good at it, but I catch fish almost every time. So, but there are moments when you're in a stream surrounded by cliffs on both sides and pine trees and birds, and you can't hear much except the water, and you hook a fish, and you bring it in and hold it before you release it, and just acknowledge it. And there are some fish, especially a brook trout. If you've ever seen a brook trout in particular, an artist couldn't paint something so beautiful, and it takes your breath away. And these experiences of delight are what draw us back to this conversation about climate change and why it's important to us. I chose to begin the book, chapter 1, with the topic of climate change because it's clear that according to most of the polls nationally, the last 2 years especially, it's been in the top 1 or 2 issues of voting Americans. And if you look at the data even more closely, you'll see that it is the #1 issue for the millennial generation. That is those early 20s to now mid 30s. That generation almost universally in every poll suggests that climate change is the #1 issue that they want to deal with. And it's the most important issue that drives them to the polls. Now, the last probably 4 to 6 months in our country, I think the attention has been less on climate change and more on race, and rightly so, given the urgency of the injustices that we're witnessing. Nevertheless, I think climate change is 1 or 2 for many Americans right now. And that may not be driving you to the polls or driving you to drop off your ballot in the box this election. But I think it's one of the important things that will drive us there. So I'll ask this question: why is it that climate change and this conversation can be so controversial for us as Americans? Can you name some of the issues that that you're aware of or that you've experienced in your own conversations that lead to more heated arguments over whether it's true or not? Anybody want to share?
Mark, I'll share since nobody's jumped in. I think a lot of the divisiveness is coming from the fact that to significantly affect climate change, you have to reduce the fossil fuel use and the smog and jobs. And it's been framed as a problem or a choice between the earth and job success. And so that's, of course, for Donald Trump, a high goal is to keep the economy going and jobs going. And so it's seen as a trade-off between jobs and the environment.
Well, there's a couple of things at work. Over the eons of time, there are natural changes. We have the ice age and then the warming and receding of the ice age. And now it's in a warming cycle. And the individual, they think that their little act of putting pollutants in the environment that, really can't change this vast earth. It doesn't have sufficient impact. They acknowledge, and everybody acknowledges, not most everybody, I think, acknowledges that there are these natural changes in creation that are at work, but they don't think that little man and his insignificant role can have any impact. But when you multiply billions of people doing things that pollute, it eventually does have an impact. But some people, just don't recognize the impact that the human has had.
I think the other thing is it requires it requires people to make a change in how they live and in how they consume. And change is hard, and the notion of giving up, or what some people would see as giving up the things you've worked so hard for, like the big car, the SUV, the whatever it may be, the greenest yard in town or whatever, folks struggle with that. And, that is pain potentially right here, right now, for a greater good that you may or may not see in your lifetime. So it's some of the long view, short view, I think, is another piece of it.
I also think that people who are wanting you to affect some changes in your life are presenting it as though you have to do this great deal of giving up. And perhaps if they promoted it as just a style change as opposed to giving up something. I'm thinking about the fact that I drive a hybrid Ford Fusion, but unless you read the label on the car that says hybrid, it looks just like any other Ford Fusion. So I haven't really given up anything other than I don't pay for as much gasoline as somebody who doesn't drive a hybrid. So I gave up paying more for gasoline. And so I think if people were focused more on just changing instead of that that it was just an adjustment as opposed that they're giving up something, we might get more response.
But what is interesting is everybody is focused on giving up. decreasing the production of greenhouse gases, CO2? What about increasing consumption? And that's possible. Photosynthesis gets rid of CO2. Trees get rid of CO2. Grass, particularly certain kinds of grass, can get rid of tons of CO2. And nobody's really focused on that particular aspect of it. And it's part of the equation. And I think we need to take more interest in that, as well as giving up some things. But if we gave up enough to lower it, my understanding is we'd be destitute. GDP would be tanked, which we don't want.
Tom, I would say, Tom, that there's
Angie, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Tom, I was going to add on to that I think there's just so many people out there that question whether what they do will make a difference, that until you can prove it to me, I'm not going to take the steps. And they don't always trust the science or believe in the science. And so it makes them difficult to, you know, they want the proof, but you can't have the proof until you do it, and then you can show the proof.
Well, there is some scientific proof that you can do it. Nickel is a substance that you can use with water and sun or photosynthesis, and you can create photosynthesis in a machine and get rid of CO2. And the carbon monoxide and the oxygen we obviously use, but the carbon monoxide, it's the end of the equation, apparently, is very, very useful for many industries.
This is Marty Chambliss.
Those of us who have incentive not to reduce pollutants in the environment, manufacturers who pollute, you know, having regulation cuts into their profits, so they don't like that. They don't like to recognize that they're polluting the environment and causing climate change. They don't like to admit that.
I'd like to add on to that too, if I could.
I think I would just whoa. I think those of us who have RVs don't really fit into that category, because I have a 3/4 ton truck to pull my travel trailer, and that's how we move from location to location to location. So I think you can't really talk about all electric vehicles or hybrids without considering those people. Thank you.
And I'd like to add on to what James said there about, I think my thought there is about the corporations and the profit is who gets to make the choice, or who draws the line on whether climate change is real or not? Is it the American people in this country who gets to say, we want clean air, we want clean water, or is it the corporations who are, you know, focused on their profits and their lobbyists and who say, well, we can't, you know, we don't want to make cheaper or cars that pollute less, or we don't want to, you know, cut down on oil production or find better ways that won't pollute, because we need, you know, we need the profits to keep the economy going. And I think Rev Mark talked about that on his sermon on Sunday, where he said something about revenue-based theology. And that's what I hear from the corporations is it's all about revenue, because that's the only thing that keeps the country going. And you know, if the water gets dirty, that's fine. So I think, I'm just wondering who gets to draw the line there, is I think a lot of times there's a controversy over it.
One of the interesting things about the pandemic was the shutdown and the dramatic change in observable from space and the amount of pollution around the large cities, where you could actually kind of see the stars and you could see the mountains for the first time in years. So we're back into it now, though. So anyway, just an observation.
I think we have a generational issue here. And the occasion of the first Earth Day, my father, who was a compatriot with George Bush, said, no way you're going to send us back into the dark ages living in caves. You may remember that the first George Bush said the American lifestyle is not open for negotiation. I have interpreted this now as saying that I was born into the American dream and now am awakening into a global catastrophe. And we're at an inflection point where we often have no option about what to do. You know, I live here, I work there, there's no public transportation to do that. My kids live someplace all the way across the country. When you start talking about how you really get yourself out of this situation, in many places we're so locked into the American dream that seeing something very different is hard for my generation because it's giving a great deal up. It's much easier for my kids to see. And for me, it's from American dream to global nightmare.
Yeah. And what I think, what I've heard in all the comments, and this is really, I think it's beautiful that we're having this conversation about what I actually preached about I think it was in March when I preached on the politics of compassion. I preached on specifically the economy of compassion. And in that sermon, we talked about what we called, and what has been called, the triple bottom line. That is people, planet, and profit. The 3 Ps: people, planet, and profit. And that, you know, the economy itself has to in some ways negotiate those 3 Ps all at once in healthy ways. And when one gets out of balance, the other 2 suffer, right? And so what I heard today is, you know, it's a people issue, it's a planet issue, and it's a profit issue. And how do we get all 3 values aligned? Because that is the American way of life, whether we like it or not. All 3 of those are integral. So, you know,
Marty was trying to get in with a comment. Let's let Marty get in. Marty, go ahead.
I feel honored to have this comment. When I was a kid, just a second here. Listen to Bishop Fulton J. Sheen, and he says, what a bright world this would be if there were only one little candle. And I think what he was saying there was we need to take personal responsibility, whether it's driving a hybrid or what. The other point that I would like to make is that global climate change is just one of a handful of straws in a bale of hay. And there's so many things to worry about that it's a matter of priorities. And where does this priority rest?
May I ask Reverend Mark a question?
Go ahead, Jim.
In your pre-publication issue, Mark, you suggested to improve the environment, we use CFLs. And I wonder if you change that to LEDs, which is later technology and uses less energy than the CFLs.
Yeah, thank you. You know, when I preached this sermon series, it was 2019, and technology was already, I think, probably already at the LED place, but I was still swapping out all my light bulbs in my house with CFLs. And I've heard from a number of people that since then LEDs really are not only are they the future, but they're the present. And so to that point, Jim, we have some things that we can do, and I outline those in the back of the chapter. Some things we can do that would require us to give up something but maybe not much, actually, all things considered. You know, simply replacing our light bulbs with LEDs, that might be an initial investment, but over time we're going to recover that, and it'll take out, you know, well over 300 pounds of carbon dioxide a year, and that'll help. We can plant a tree. I think that was what Tom mentioned earlier. We can actually do something proactive that will consume CO2 from our environment, and it'll absorb like one single tree would absorb a 1 ton of carbon dioxide over its lifetime. Just one tree. We can moderate our meat consumption, and I know that's tricky. We've got people in our congregation that are in the beef industry, and they're my favorite people in the world. So these are sensitive suggestions, but a doctor probably would tell us the same thing. Limit your red meat consumption, because it's while it's good for you, it's also too much of it can be bad for you. But by doing that, we rely less on cows, which emit methane. They're the highest methane producers on the globe, and they exhale it with every single breath. We can reduce the number of miles that we drive every week by walking or carpooling, biking, taking mass transit. And if we just reduce our weekly driving by 10 miles a week, we could eliminate about 500 pounds of CO2 a year individually. And so these are things that wouldn't really require us to sacrifice much to make a difference. We know that the last poll I read was June of 2020, just a few months ago, that 61% of US Americans now believe that climate change is caused by human activity, and that it's a serious issue. So that's different from when I actually originally preached this sermon last year. It was closer to 52 to 53%. So things are moving along in this conversation. People, I think, are taking responsibility for learning, and then again, a majority of Americans, as I mentioned in the video that we began with, the majority of Americans, over 60%, are now actively doing something in their regular daily routines to make a difference in climate change. I think that's very hopeful, actually. That's enough people to say, this is real and we can do something. And I think that's totally the American spirit and at work. So these are good things to be talking about. We'll keep going with some of these. You know, what are ways that I mentioned earlier the axiom number 1, when the risks are high, the wise hedge their bets. What are ways that, outside of the climate change conversation, what are ways that when we look at potential problems in our lives or in the world that we hedge our bets? Can you name some of those things that we do?
Insurance.
Insurance, yeah. So the likelihood that we will ever benefit from a life insurance policy is actually extremely slim. Most people, by the time they die, they don't usually have a life insurance policy. So, but the devastating effect it would have on our families, especially when we're younger and we're working full time, that effect on our families would be tremendous. I don't know about you all, but this year right now, 2020, I am paying $30,000 a year for health insurance. I've not been to the doctor once. My wife hasn't been to the doctor once. My kids haven't been to the doctor once. But insofar as we needed a doctor in a crisis, that would be helpful. Any other ways that we hedge our bets?
Vaccines.
Say it again, David. Vaccines. Absolutely. That's a great insight. And here we are in the middle of a pandemic talking about who's going to take one and who's not when it's readily available. So that's a great, right?
I like to think in this case of an example that was used to convince us to go to war when we were considering whether there was a risk of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, in Dick Cheney got before us and told us if there's even just a 1% chance that there are weapons there, that we can't live with or accept that risk. And that was used, I thought, as a kind of propaganda, but it was used to convince us that that was justification to start a war. And you know, it's the same kind of thinking, though. If it's a very slim chance that climate change is contributed to by mankind's activities, but the outcome of that, you know, of that consequence is unacceptable, we have to treat it as if it's 100% certainty and make sure it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Well, on the smaller pragmatic side, I think most of us keep candles and a flashlight and some batteries around in case the power goes out. And over the last 30, 40 years, the power grid's gotten much more reliable, but you know, got to hedge that bet.
Yeah. Yeah. If anybody on this call ever lived in California for any period of time, you know that it was the wisest thing in the world to keep a earthquake kit in the house. And in our family, we had one of those big old shipping trunks that always had plenty of water, had batteries, flashlights, candles, some canned goods, right, to hedge our bets in the event of an earthquake. So it's interesting that hedging our bets actually is part of the American way of life. And it's been that way for decades and centuries. And so if we can approach it as, you know, again, taking some actions in our lives to make a difference, and understand that we do this in all aspects of our lives. And many of those, for instance, insurance, either car insurance, health insurance, life insurance, are quite expensive hedges, actually. So I think what I'd like to do is just turn our focus to a scripture reading that I use to talk about the distinction between dominion and domination that I think we fail to miss when we think about our duty and our responsibilities, as well as our privileges in modern society. So I want to read to you from Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 31. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air, over every living thing that moves upon the earth." And God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and every bird of the air, and everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed, it was very good. This really rich image of a creator God caring about all aspects of life, not just human life, but even things that creep upon the face of the earth. A God who creates, as it says, everything in God's own image. Again, this idea that creation is really God's first incarnation, God's first moment of sort of materializing as we might say, in physical form, which is a powerful thing. So the distinction that we have here is this word dominion. It occurs, I think, 3 times here. Dominion over the earth. What does dominion mean to us? Love to hear your input. What is dominion?
I hear that as meaning we have responsibility. God's given us what we need, but we're created in his image, so that I don't see God wasting things or just using things up because it's convenient. So along with what we have a responsibility to take care of it.
I think maybe manage for the good of all. I think that was what a pastor kind of does for a church, and a teacher does in a classroom. They manage that area for the goodness of everybody involved.
Also opportunity.
I didn't hear you, Judy. What did you say?
Opportunity as well as responsibility. Think of it.
Yeah.
Maybe having opportunities to do things you could not do otherwise, and that were not possible for other things or people or other things or creation have a special place.
Yeah. Opportunity and responsibility. Great. Any other thoughts on dominion?
Mark, I see dominion as being kind of a kind and just authority over the creation versus domination as a malevolent, selfish use of the creation. So I'm not sure if that's an accurate distinction, but it sounds like it to me.
Yeah.
Mark, I took some time before the session tonight to look at the Common English Bible translation of Genesis. And I saw their translation in a new way. They translate the Hebrew word take charge. You are to take charge of the fish of the sea, birds of the sky, everything crawling on the earth. And the nuances in that for me, I kind of like that. The nuances are you're responsible also. You're accountable for what you do for good or what you do to destroy, to harm what you've been given charge of.
That's great. That's a great image. Yeah. Take charge. Anybody else want to say anything here? So in the book, I kind of liken it to the role. Ron mentioned the role of like the pastor with the congregation. I speak about it in the book. This idea, the relationship between a parent and his or her children, and that I think is consistent with what Harvey is identifying in the Common English Bible translation around taking charge. As parents, we do take charge of our kids, and this idea that we are ultimately responsible for them for a period of time. It's our job to do everything we can to make them thrive, and also to stop any activities which might hinder their ability to thrive. And so we're constantly investing in our kids to grow into the fullest expression of who they can be, so that they can flourish. And it's the same imagery, I think, for us in the book of Genesis, that all of these things that God creates are under our care, and we take charge of them. We manage them as resources that are finite resources and limited. And so to that point, we would never look at our sick child and say, I see that there's something wrong, but I'm not sure I want to necessarily trust the science here. And I'm going to let this child suffer even more as a result. maybe the arm looks broken, but they might say one thing and it might be the other. And so let's just see what happens. We would never do that as loving, caring parents. And I know that's an oversimplification to some extent, but maybe not. Maybe at least we can be mindful of the fact that that the call, the charge here is to manage the resources we've been given in a responsible way, as opposed to neglect or to approach these things with some degree of apathy or the kind of silence that says, I don't know, and so I'm not going to do anything. And so we're called to practice here dominion, which is not domination. Domination is coercion, it's exploitation, it's seeing the other, whether that's creation or another person, as truly an object rather than a subject, right? And so in the book, I talk about, again, this core commitment to a politics of compassion is kinship. And in kinship, in radical kinship, we see the other not as an object, but as a subject with which we commune in deeper connection. Any thoughts on that? Did I stir any insights? Feel free to offer up anything.
Dominance is what you can have over your 3-year-old. Dominion is how you deal with a teenager.
Good. Yeah, spoken like a true pediatrician there.
I think that dominion is for the common good. When you look, certain states, Kentucky, I believe, is the dominion of Kentucky. And the idea is it's for the common good.
Right. Yeah, and it all comes back to that very issue of where can we find enough common ground to work together for the common good? And despite which side of the aisle we're on, is there enough space there to meet and create a plan so that in this case all creation can flourish? And so let me ask this question. In verse 31, it says, God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. In our minds, or at least maybe in our culture, are there forms of life or aspects of the creation that seem to be of greater or lesser value to us as US Americans? Do we have sort of a gradient of value in our, at least maybe we wouldn't acknowledge it verbally, but it's based in the way we consume? Any thoughts there?
Mosquitoes we don't value, dogs and cats we do.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and mosquitoes are having a really tough time tonight anyway.
So maybe on a more serious note, coming from Texas, one of the things that always marveled me about living in Texas is that we never had any bullet trains in Texas. So you go to Europe and there's bullet trains all over. And when I was leaving Texas this year, the legislature there is just now approaching the idea of actually constructing a bullet train from Dallas to Houston. And if you can imagine, you drive to Houston from Dallas, it takes about 5.5 hours. A bullet train would do it in half that time. And it's all electric. It's all managed by electricity. And so this is the question I always pose to people whenever they ask me about how we value commodities in our culture in America as we consume. Why aren't there any bullet trains in America? And, for me, I think it goes directly to Mark's question. Because the more bullet trains there are, the less planes we need. And the far fewer planes we need, the less oil we consume. You know, and those supply chains have drastic impacts on our economy that a lot of people are just not willing to deal with.
For those that don't know, Rev Jerry is going to lead our discussion next week on chapter 2.
On the subject of dominion, you know, God gave man dominion over all the creatures of the earth, but for his own dominion over man, he gave up some of it by giving man free will. So we can direct our activities where most animals, you know, as far as we know, they don't plan ahead. They don't treat each other like mankind treats their fellow human beings.
And so to that point, Jim, I think that goes right to my question in terms of how we value life. And I think we probably all agree that that human life takes precedent over other, what we might call lower forms of life. You know, animals and insects and these kinds of things. And yet those other things, it doesn't mean necessarily that those things don't matter or that they're not valuable to God. But we tend to value human life sometimes at the expense of other things, to Jerry's point earlier. Any other thoughts on that?
I think we tend to value scenery, which is why there are a whole lot of people coming to Colorado, rather than some other parts of the country that may be stinking hot or whatever in the summer and cold and freezing in the winter. So we also value certainly parts of the natural world above other places in the natural world.
Yeah.
Well, I think to your question a minute ago about is there a hierarchy and the way we value things as modern Americans, and that where my mind was too was right there and was back in the beginning of your conversation. You talked about we belong to the earth, and I thought there about the Native Americans, and that was really their whole life philosophy is we belong to the earth and we are to care for the earth, so we don't overharvest it. You know, we don't overuse it. We leave no trace when we move from one place to another, and we care for it. And I think they did not really have a hierarchy of what was, you know, what resources they could use, overuse, and what resources they shouldn't. But they had a hierarchy of it's all part of us because we're part of the world.
And the ancients, you know, they would give their fields a year off, right? To that very point, they wouldn't exhaust its resources for good, but they would allow it to replenish itself every few years. Yeah.
Mark, just a quick comment, if I could. Next week is chapter 2 on racism, and it reminds me talking about the hierarchy of what we value in lives. Obviously, we're in a period now when Black Lives Matter is a slogan, and many Black people feel like their lives don't matter as much as white lives. So even within the human life spectrum, people of color feel they don't matter as much as others.
And certainly in our culture today, in our country, much of our action tends to suggest that's true. It's been institutionalized, that perception that some lives are more valuable than others. Yeah. So you know, an hour and a half online Zoom Bible study is rough. In my mind, this is an hour and 15 to hour and 20. And so if we turn the corner a little bit with one more question, and we hinted at this earlier, and it's the last question I posed in the study guide for this chapter. And it's, is it possible to maintain a thriving US economy while implementing responsible climate policies that reduce or minimize atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases? Is it possible to have a thriving economy and still do something even beyond the individual actions that we talked about earlier? Is it possible to think, because we're talking about politics and how we vote impacts legislation, is it possible to have a thriving US economy and still care for the earth legislatively? Yeah, Barb.
Absolutely. There's Scandinavian countries that are doing it currently. And most of the rest of the world has set much more aggressive goals than we have. And when you look to Europe, which is specifically what I'm most familiar with, they have more aggressive targets. They've made more progress. And those economies are doing just as well as we are, in some cases, arguably better. I do believe when you look at the fossil fuel industry, some might disagree, but it is now more expensive in some cases to produce fossil fuels than it is to produce green fuels. And so there is industry and jobs and work and support and all of that around all of those industries. Same too with solar, and we in Colorado live somewhere where solar would be very, very viable and is already for some folks. There's a whole industry around that. So the notion that becoming greener equals ruining our economy, I have to disagree. And if no one is alive, so if we don't have drinkable water, if we don't have breathable air, it's all for naught anyways. So I think it's very, very possible, and I think it's necessary.
One of the difficulties today, I think, is defining what a thriving economy is. Is it the stock market? Is it full employment, or at least employment, so that everybody who is working is receiving a living wage? But I think that's a big part of the decision making that we're going to have to make in the next 10, 15, 20, 50 years.
Dave, I think that's a great insight. And I think there's a growing number of people in our country who would say that our economy is not thriving, insofar as the uber rich continue to get richer, while the economy doesn't really benefit the greater proportion of the population. I mean, that's the argument. And to that point, I don't want to dominate this, but I do think, and I sort of overheard it in both comments, that that maybe a thriving economy is that nobody has need, right? Maybe that's the baseline, that nobody has needs beyond their capacity to meet them. And I think there's going to be a day when we're having more serious conversations about universal basic income. And there's a lot of folks in our country today who would say that's a socialist policy. It's actually not. The very first person who conceived of universal basic income was Richard Nixon. And it came out of a Republican administration. And it was only until later when they decided that sort of created that concept of a moral hazard that said, if you give people money, they're gonna waste it. And then the conversation changed. But I tend to think that even things like universal basic income feed into conversations about climate change, if we're concerned about the jobs issue and the economy. So I hope that's not a rant, and I hope I'm not being unfair, but I do want to say universal basic income is something that we need to continue to have conversations about. It's not Democratic, it's not Republican, it's both, and there can be some interesting common ground there. Any other thoughts on thriving economy?
Well, I think you're going to have to get rid of CO2. Not only the production, but also get rid of it. And that's possible scientifically. And the Arctic Circle and the tundra underneath that, there's more CO2 than we'll ever generate. And if that gets warm and it's going to be released, it's impossible. And science can do that. But nobody thinks about that. Everybody thinks decreased production, which is good. But you got to treat it too. And that's possible.
So I'm so grateful, Tom, for that insight. I think, again, it gets back to that we're not just making sacrifices. We're also creating opportunities for us, to do good and to benefit from that. Any other last thoughts on that final question? Because I think this is the question, and it was named earlier when we just began our conversation. It tends to be about the economy at the very end of the conversation. Can we have a robust economy? Yeah, Barb.
Well, I think already positive from COVID is that people are working from home and there are fewer cars on the road. Even our insurance company is giving a rebate because there aren't as many accidents because there aren't as many cars. So we see this positive of people working at home.
Yeah, great point.
Well, and look at all the cars that didn't drive to church tonight because we.
That's true.
Yeah, I would probably prefer to be at church right now with you all, but we did save part of the the climate tonight.
A comment about the CO2. My older granddaughter's boyfriend works for ExxonMobil, and his task is to take CO2 and put it back into the earth. That's what his project is.
Yeah, fascinating. Wow. Well, we just had this amazing conversation about an otherwise controversial issue, and it was beautiful, and I'm grateful for the insight and the trust that we have together as a congregation, and I'm grateful for the ability that we have to meet on some basic concepts or axioms that can generate more fruitful conversations than the ones that are happening in the real world. What I would suggest, and I mentioned earlier an article I'm writing right now for Pathos, which is an online journal. If we can keep our conversations for the most part off of actual parties or political leaders, and instead focus them on shared common interests and concerns, we're gonna move the ball down the field with some of this stuff without hurting each other. So I advise people, don't talk about elected officials or officials that are up for election, because that just moves us right into tribal camps, right? And we know suddenly whose team we're playing for. But instead, if we say to the other who may disagree with us, what is it that we can agree on that is our common concern? And let's start there and expand the conversation from there. And I think we did that tonight. We didn't really talk much about political leaders. We talked about our common concerns and what we can do, common solutions. So I'll offer some more suggestions along the way. I will join you in and out. I don't think I'll be with you next week, but I will promise to jump in and out here and there when I can, because I think this is where church happens, right here. This kind of community that we share. So thank you for your honest and deep investment in this conversation. And I'd like to close with a prayer. And then
Mark, before you do that, in your movie, you referenced a book called War, I think it was.
Yeah.
Who was the author?
Yeah, it's a fabulous book. It was written, I think 2 years ago. It's Omar El Akkad. In fact, I have the book right here. Let me pull it off my bookshelf. When you read and you love books, you know exactly where to find them.
Yes.
So here's the book, Omar El Akkad, and it's called American War. American War.
Thank you.
And it really is about, it's set in the context of, I think it's 2076 or 2078 is when it begins, and it actually goes into the 2100s. And the context is a civil war between the North and the South, where fossil fuels, are prohibited, and that sparks a war from the Southerners. And it's about how you're going to survive in a climate catastrophe, and it's quite good.
Might be the third Civil War.
Yeah, right.
Mark, I have a question, if I may, before you close this out. You have provided us a superb resource across the church, and I am so grateful, and I know thousands of other people are going to be grateful. What kind of feedback are you getting?
Mostly positive. I think I think most people are finding that it really does provide an honest and fair, sort of judicious place to begin conversations. I think some of the feedback I've had is that it tends to be slightly left leaning, and that may be true. I don't consider myself a liberal, but I do think of myself as somebody who is progressive in thought and in action, and so that's you're going to find that in the book, and you'll even just on this issue that we talked about tonight, an argument that it's better to do something than nothing, and that we're obligated to do that morally and scripturally. So the feedback's been mostly good. I think there are issues that are going to trigger for some, right? I have to say, some reviews have been, hey, the chapter on homosexuality is a non-starter, and it just happens to be where you're at theologically, and that chapter doesn't create a big common ground center for people to have conversations. I'm fairly clear about that, and so some have accused me of cherry picking scripture on that particular topic, but that's okay. The other side does it too. So, we're trying to have conversations about justice and mercy and compassion. So yeah, it's been good. And today is actually launch day. So the book officially launched on Amazon today. I know many of you got your copies early because Chalice sent them early. But yeah, it's a big day, and hopefully the book sells, not because I want it to for myself, but because I believe that it's a gospel that reflects St. Andrew's values and mission and outward focus. And I really wanted to garner the attention of our world so that St. Andrew is perceived as a thought leader, as a congregation. And I'm really proud to be the author of this book, but I will say that collectively we wrote it in our living and in our practice, and we're still writing it. So
thank you.
So yeah, share it with others, post it on Facebook. I'm not one to self-promote, and so I need everybody else, if they believe in it, to buy a copy and share it, and get people excited about it. So thanks, Harvey, I appreciate that.
Issues.
Let me close. Go ahead. Did somebody? Was that you, Jim?
Yeah, I said issues, not parties.
Yeah.
That's what I've tried to discuss when I'm talking to people. I never mention parties, just talk about issues.
Good. Let me offer this prayer as we close our time together. God of heaven and earth, you desire a reconciliation of the whole creation. But forgive us our selfish and destructive ways. Help us to see your presence and glory in all living things, and to walk humbly on the earth as we seek a life that is more connected to you and to all that you have created and called good. Through Christ our Lord we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, friends. Great to see you, and I'm so grateful for the conversation. Steve, did you want to have any last words?
Great discussion, Mark. Thank you for taking the time tonight. And if anybody has questions, email me or Mark, and we will see you next week at same time, same station.
Good night.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Blessings, y'all.
Oh, could you put on interlude for this past Saturday?